At some point, you wanted more. More income, more financial breathing room, more of the kind of freedom that money, however imperfectly, makes possible. Maybe it was a clear thought, a number in your head, a life you could picture with some precision. Maybe it was vaguer than that. Just a persistent sense that things could be different, that the current arrangement was not the ceiling, that more was available, and you wanted to reach for it. And then, almost immediately, something else arrived. Not doubt about whether more was achievable. Something older than doubt and quieter than doubt. Something that didn't question the possibility. It questioned the wanting itself. A feeling that the desire was somehow wrong. That wanting more money, specifically, revealed something unflattering about you. That people who wanted more, who said so openly, who organized their choices around getting it, these were people with a certain kind of problem. A problem of character, of values, of confusing what matters with what costs. You probably didn't think any of this explicitly. It arrived as a feeling, not an argument. A faint internal resistance whenever the ambition surfaced too clearly. Tendency to qualify the desire when it came up in conversation. Not greedy, just want to be comfortable, just want to be secure, just want my kids to have options. The apology was automatic. The scaling back happened before the thought was even finished. This is not a personal quirk. It's not a sign of psychological damage or unusual sensitivity. It is one of the most consistent emotional patterns in the financial lives of ordinary people. The instinct to feel guilty about financial ambition. And it has a history long enough and deep enough that following it back to its source changes. Something about how it feels to have it. Start with where the feeling lives in the body. Because it's important to be precise about what guilt actually is before explaining why it attaches to money. Guilt is not the same as shame, though they're frequently confused. Shame is about identity, the feeling that you are wrong, defective, unworthy in some essential way. Guilt is about action, the feeling that you have done or are contemplating doing, something that violates a moral standard you hold. Shame says, there is something wrong with me. Guilt says, there is something wrong with what I want to do. The distinction matters here because the feeling most people have about wanting more money is closer to guilt than shame. It's not that they feel fundamentally bad people for having the desire. It's that the desire itself feels morally suspect, like it's crossing a line. Like wanting more in a world where many have so little carries a moral weight that wanting other things, love, health, recognition, purpose, doesn't carry in the same way. Why money specifically? Why does the desire for more money produce this particular moral unease when the desire for more of almost anything else, more time, more respect, more creative fulfillment, more physical health, produces nothing like it? The answer is not simple, and it's not contained in any single explanation. It was assembled over centuries from several different directions simultaneously, each one laying down a layer of the guilt, each one reinforcing the others, until the emotional response became so deeply embedded that it now operates independently of any of the original sources. The guilt runs automatically. It doesn't require the arguments that built it to keep functioning. They did their work long ago. The oldest layer is religious. In virtually every major religious tradition that shaped Western and South Asian culture, Christianity, Islam, certain strands of Hindu philosophy, the ethical frameworks that emerged. From Buddhist thinking, wealth occupies an ambiguous or explicitly suspicious moral position. Not because money itself is evil, which is a misquotation of a more complex teaching, but because the desire for wealth was understood as a competitor for the spiritual orientation required by each tradition. The Christian tradition in particular encoded a specific and powerful message about money that saturated European culture for over a millennium and migrated with that culture into every society it touched. Wealth accumulated beyond necessity was morally dangerous. The wealthy man and the eye of the needle. The love of money as the root of all evil. Again, a misquotation, but the misquotation became the operative cultural message. Contentment with one's station. The spiritual virtue of poverty, the corruption that comfort reliably brought to the soul. These weren't fringe positions. They were the central operating moral framework of entire civilizations for hundreds of years. They were taught to children. They were reinforced in community. They were internalized across generations until they stopped being external teachings and became internal convictions that people experienced as their own moral instincts. The specific form this conditioning takes in modern secular people who may not practice any religion, who may explicitly reject religious frameworks, who consider themselves entirely outside this tradition, is a particular kind of surprise, because they have the guilt without the theology. They feel the wrongness of wanting more money without being able to point to any belief system that would account for it. The feeling is there, but the source is invisible. which makes it, if anything, harder to examine and easier to mistake for something innate, for moral reality rather than inherited conditioning. The second layer came from a different direction entirely, not religious but political, and not ancient but modern. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as industrial capitalism produced both enormous wealth and enormous misery in the same visible proximity, a set of political and intellectual traditions emerged that placed the desire for personal wealth in direct moral opposition to collective well-being. In Marxist and socialist thinking, the accumulation of personal wealth was not merely a spiritual distraction. It was a social harm. The wealthy individual was wealthy because the poor were poor. The prosperity of the few was extracted from the labor of the many, and the desire to accumulate more was therefore a desire to perpetuate and extend that extraction. This framework was not a fringe academic position. It became, in various forms, the organizing ideology of movements, revolutions, and governments across the entire 20th century. It shaped trade unions and political parties and intellectual cultures across the developed world. Even in societies that rejected socialist governance, the moral framework it contained, that personal wealth accumulation comes at collective cost, entered the cultural conversation and stayed there. The residue of this, in modern culture, is a specific moral vocabulary that activates around financial ambition, greed, exploitation, hoarding, the 1%. These words carry moral weight that's immediately legible to almost anyone in modern society, and they're organized around a framework in which wanting more, when you already have enough, becomes ethically suspect because someone else is having less is at least partly its consequence. This moral framework is not simply wrong. It contains real observations about real mechanisms by which wealth and poverty relate to each other in actually existing economies. But its effect in the psychology of ordinary people trying to improve their own financial lives is mostly not to produce more equitable economic policies. Its effect is to produce guilt that attaches to the desire for personal financial advancement without meaningfully benefiting anyone who might be worse off. The guilt doesn't redistribute wealth. It only makes the person feeling it more conflicted about building any. The third layer is the most intimate and the hardest to see clearly because it was laid down earliest, by the people closest to you, from a place of genuine love. The financial culture of a family is one of the most powerful psychological inheritances a person receives. Not the explicit lessons, the things parents actually say about money, but the emotional texture of how money was experienced. Whether scarcity was normal or exceptional, whether financial ambition was encouraged or treated with suspicion, whether talking about wanting more was welcomed or met with a particular kind of discomfort. In families where money was tight, and this describes the majority of families across economic history, the emotional relationship with money is frequently complex in a specific way. Wanting more than was available produces pain, pain that can't always be addressed because the solution isn't accessible. And the mind, which is extraordinarily resourceful in managing pain that can't be resolved, sometimes arrives at a particular adaptation. It reframes the wanting as the problem rather than the scarcity as the problem. If wanting is what hurts, then not wanting is what heals. This is the logic, never stated explicitly, that produces in many people a deep, pre-rational suspicion of financial desire. The child who watched a parent stressed by not having enough learns, somewhere in the nonverbal processing of childhood experience, that money is a source of pain. The parent who struggled may have communicated, not deliberately, not unkindly, but inevitably, that contentment is safer than ambition, that wanting too much leads to disappointment, that knowing your place financially is a form of self-protection. The adult who carries this legacy doesn't experience it as a lesson they learned. They experience it as a feeling that arrives whenever financial ambition surfaces, a vague unease, a sense that something is wrong about wanting this much, a reflexive dampening of desire before it can become hope, because hope that doesn't materialize is the specific pain that the early conditioning was designed to prevent. And here is the cruelty of the inheritance, the protection it was designed to provide. The cushioning of disappointment, the management of pain, is itself a mechanism of limitation. The desire that is suppressed before it becomes ambition is also the desire that, if it had been allowed to develop, might have produced something different. The very instinct that protected the child from a specific pain becomes the ceiling on what the adult can allow themselves to reach for. Now add culture to the inheritance, and the picture becomes fuller. The cultural messaging around money and contentment in most societies is not neutral. It is systematically tilted toward acceptance of the financial position in which a person was born, and systematically suspicious of the desire to occupy a different one. The wisdom traditions of almost every culture include some version of the teaching that contentment is a virtue and ambition is a risk. That the person who wants what they have is happy, and the person who wants what they don't have is suffering. That the right relationship with money is gratitude for what you have, not hunger for more. These teachings are not without value. The research on hedonic adaptation, the well-documented psychological phenomenon by which people return to roughly the same level of happiness after both positive and negative life changes, genuinely does suggest that chasing external improvements as the primary source of well-being is a poor strategy. The person who imagines that a higher income will permanently change how they feel about their life is statistically mistaken. But that insight gets weaponized in cultural messaging in a specific way. It gets applied exclusively to financial ambition, never to the ambition for more love, more health, more meaning, more creative expression. Nobody tells you that wanting deeper relationships is evidence of a poor relationship with wanting. Nobody suggests that pursuing better health is spiritually suspect. The contentment doctrine is applied asymmetrically, with precision, to money, as if money specifically, and money alone, is the domain in which wanting more reveals a character problem. This asymmetry is worth pausing on, because it is not philosophically coherent. If the problem with financial desire were genuinely about the psychology of wanting, about hedonic adaptation, about the failure of external circumstances to provide lasting fulfillment, then that argument would apply equally to the desire for better health, deeper relationships, more creative achievement. It doesn't. The contentment teaching, in its cultural application, is specifically financial, which means it isn't really about the psychology of wanting at all. It's about something else, something that has more to do with social control than spiritual wisdom. Let's say that clearly, because it's the part that tends to produce the most resistance. The social function of financial guilt is not to produce spiritually liberated people who have transcended the corrupting influence of money. The social function of financial guilt is to produce people who do not compete aggressively for resources, who accept the financial position they occupy without excessive friction, who direct the energy that might have gone into building wealth toward managing, gracefully and without complaint, the financial circumstances they inherited. This is useful to a functioning social hierarchy, not in a conspiratorial sense, not because someone sat down and designed financial guilt as a control mechanism, but in the sense that social hierarchies like biological ecosystems develop the features that help them persist. And the feature of moral suspicion around financial ambition in the lower and middle classes, combined with the complete absence of that suspicion at the top of the hierarchy where wealth is simply expected and admired, is precisely the feature that a stratified society would evolve if it were optimizing for its own continuation. Look at how differently financial ambition is discussed depending on where in the social hierarchy it appears. At the top, the wealthy, the ultra-wealthy, the dynastically rich, financial ambition is framed as vision, as leadership, as the expression of the drive and intelligence that created value and deservedly captured reward. The billionaire who accumulates beyond any conceivable personal need is not discussed in the cultural mainstream as someone with a greed problem. They are discussed as an exceptional person who built something extraordinary. At the bottom and middle, the working class, the professional middle class, the salaried employee, financial ambition is fraught with the moral language we've been examining. Too ambitious, obsessed with money, has their priorities wrong, doesn't appreciate what they have. The desire for significantly more than the current position is read as a character signal rather than a human one. The guilt is not distributed evenly. It is distributed precisely where it does the most work, among the people whose financial advancement would require them to extract a larger share of available resources from the people who currently hold them. Here's what that guilt actually costs, not metaphorically, but in the specific concrete texture of a financial life. When my financial desire is infected with guilt, it doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It continues operating. The wanting doesn't stop, but it loses the quality of intentionality that would make it productive. The person still wants more money, but because the wanting feels morally compromised, they can't pursue it openly, plan for it clearly, organize their choices around it systematically. The desire is present, but it can't be owned. And a desire that can't be owned can't be effectively served. This produces a particular pattern that appears again and again in the financial behavior of guilt-carrying people. They make financial decisions indirectly, optimizing for the appearance of responsible behavior rather than for the outcome they actually want. They frame financial goals in neutral, socially acceptable language rather than in their actual terms. They sabotage their own income advancement in subtle ways, underselling in negotiations, declining to advocate for their own value, accepting below-market compensation rather than enduring the discomfort of asking for more. They frame wealth building as something they're doing for their children, for their security, for practical reasons. Never for themselves, never because they want it, because wanting it for themselves still carries the taint. The financial cost of this is not trivial. Studies on salary negotiation consistently show that the people who negotiate least aggressively, who accept the first offer, who avoid pushing for more, whose discomfort with advocating for their own financial interests leads them to accept less than the market would bear, leave significant money on the table across their careers. Not in a single negotiation, but in the compounding effect of systematically undervaluing their own labor across decades. This is what financial guilt costs, not a feeling. A compounding financial disadvantage that accumulates quietly across every interaction in which money is on the table and the person on one side of it is less willing to fight for their own interests than the person on the other. There's a dimension of this that touches something deeper than career or investment decisions, and it deserves careful attention. The guilt around wanting more money is frequently entangled with a person's sense of what they deserve. And that sense of deserving, the internal ledger on which we keep track of what we have earned and what we are entitled to ask for, and what level of good fortune falls within the legitimate boundaries of a life like ours, is not set by objective assessment. It is set by the same forces that set the guilt, by family, by culture, by class, by the careful observation from childhood of what people like us receive and what people unlike us receive, and the unspoken conclusion that the difference reflects something real about merit and worthiness. The person who grew up in financial scarcity doesn't just carry a practical disadvantage in the form of limited starting capital. They carry a psychological one in the form of an internal ceiling on what they believe they legitimately deserve to have. And this ceiling is not experienced as a ceiling. It is experienced as reality, as an accurate assessment of what's reasonable, as the voice of modesty and proportion that keeps expectations aligned with likely outcomes. What it actually is a conditioned limit. An identity boundary drawn in childhood by the experience of a specific economic position, maintained in adulthood by the guilt that activates whenever the desire to exceed it surfaces. The deserving threshold is not an objective truth about what this person could achieve or what they should have. It is a psychological artifact of where they came from, wearing the mask of self-knowledge. The wealthy don't have this ceiling, not because they are more deserving, but because their early experience didn't install it. They were raised in environments where significant financial resources were normal, where the expectation of comfort and opportunity and expanding wealth was part of the emotional fabric of daily life. Their internal model of what people like them receive is calibrated entirely differently, not from arrogance, simply from experience. And that internal calibration changes how they negotiate, how they invest, how they respond to opportunity, how much they believe they can ask for and receive without transgressing something. The psychological inheritance of class is not primarily about what you know. It's about what you believe you deserve. And that belief, operating below conscious awareness, does more to determine financial outcomes than any specific financial decision. What would it look like to want more money without guilt? Not recklessly, not without ethical consideration, not without care for the people the money affects, not without awareness of how economic systems actually work, but cleanly, without the reflexive apology, without the qualification and the scaling back and the framing in acceptable language. It would look like treating financial ambition as morally equivalent to any other form of ambition, like recognizing that wanting to build something financially significant is not a different category of human desire from wanting to create something artistically significant or intellectually significant or socially significant. That the desire to improve one's financial position is a legitimate expression of the same drive toward growth and self-determination that every culture valorizes in every other domain. It would look like separating the ethics of how money is accumulated from the fact of wanting to accumulate it. These are distinct questions that the guilt conflates. Whether the methods of building wealth are ethical is a real and important question. Whether the desire to build wealth is itself morally suspect is a different question, one that, examined clearly and honestly, has a much simpler answer than the guilt implies. It would look like the ability to say, without qualification or apology, that more is wanted. That the current financial position, whatever its real merits, is not the ceiling. That the internal resistance to that desire is not the voice of wisdom or the expression of genuine values. It is, at least in substantial part, the accumulated weight of a conditioning that served interests other than your own and never asked your consent before installing itself. The guilt doesn't disappear the moment it's named. Psychological conditioning isn't that cooperative. But something changes when the architecture of it becomes visible, when the religious layer and the political layer and the family layer and the class layer are each identified clearly, when the social function of the guilt is understood, when the financial cost of carrying it is calculated honestly. What changes is the relationship to the feeling. The guilt continues to arrive, but it arrives now as a recognizable artifact rather than as a verdict, as a conditioned response with a traceable history rather than as a moral truth about the nature of wanting, as something that happened to you rather than something that reveals you. And in that shift, in the small but significant movement from experiencing the guilt as self-knowledge to experiencing it as inherited noise, something becomes possible that wasn't before. Not freedom from the feeling. Freedom from the feeling's authority. The wanting is allowed to exist, fully, clearly, without the reflex of apology and qualification. The desire for more financial capacity, more options, more of the freedom that money imperfectly but genuinely provides, can be held without immediately diminishing it, can be planned around, can be pursued without the continuous background conviction that the pursuit itself is evidence of something wrong. That shift is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with the drama of a conversion or the clarity of a revelation. It arrives as a gradual, almost imperceptible change in the quality of the internal relationship with money, a loosening of something that has been tight for so long it stopped being noticed. And then, in the space that the loosening creates, something can begin to build that the guilt had been preventing for years, not because the guilt was the only obstacle. It wasn't. The practical obstacles are real, and they remain. But the practical obstacles, at least, respond to effort. The guilt responds to nothing but examination, and the financial life that becomes possible once the examination is complete, once the inherited weight is understood as inherited and set down, is a different thing from the financial life that guilt has been quietly managing all along. It is, for possibly the first time, a financial life that belongs entirely to you.